Hey, we are back again. It is Friday, August 4th, and this is GPS Live, and I'm Tristan Morris, and Jonathan is out today, so we are joined by
Trace Hollifield.
Trace Hollifield, returning guest. Always a pleasure to have you on. We've got some interesting stuff to talk about this week, man, including stuff that relates back to things that we've talked about before, specifically.
Hey, things come full circle, man.
Full circle. It never ends. Before we get started with the actual show, I want to say thank you to anyone who is joining us live to watch this. If you are watching this live right now, we can see your comments as they come in, so feel free to interact with us, engage on any stories, let us know your thoughts. We love having those conversations with you guys throughout the course of the show. And if you're watching this on demand, we can still see those comments later. We definitely like going through those and kind of figuring out if we're on the right direction with the kind of stories that we're covering and if you guys like what you are seeing. So feel free to drop a comment. Let us know you're here, what brought you to us. And also we do want to point out before we get going, I'm rushing through things a little bit right now because we've actually got a lot to talk about this week. But I want to make sure that we point out that anything that we say on this show is just Trace and my's opinion. It is not necessarily the official opinion or view of GuidePoint Security. We're just a couple of guys talking about cybersecurity and the stories that we found interesting this week. Trace, how are you doing, man?
Doing fantastic, man. August has kicked off with a bang. We've got a lot of business running around, helping customers get the roadmaps and strategies put together. So extremely blessed to be this busy.
Yes, it is a busy month. I can attest to that. We've been doing a lot on our side as well. So GPS Live for August 4th, 2023. Before we get into like the official stories that we've got lined up for this week, man, anything caught your eye or anything like interesting since the last time you were on that you're just like, man, I really wish that we could have talked about that?
Well, I know some of the stories that we're going to cover today, really like vulnerabilities are one of my favorite spots to talk about when it comes to security. And I know that our number one story is going to go over that, but ultimately it's keeping your house clean, knowing what you got and locking those things down. And that takes discipline. And that's one thing is a lot of people just don't do on a regular basis.
Yeah. It's tough to keep up with that, especially with the shortages that we've got going on right now in personnel and across pretty much all workforces. But specifically within cybersecurity, keep it on top of just like the regular maintenance of stuff, knowing what's in your environment for sure. And like you said, that is why that is important for the first story that we've got for this week, which is that CISA, the FBI, NSA, a bunch of Five Eyes, so the Five Eyes countries that we align with, have released a list of the 12 most exploited vulnerabilities of 2022. So the top 12 vulnerabilities of last year. This is important. This story comes to us from securityaffairs.com. That's where I found it. But the reason this kind of list is so important and this bulletin that they put out is so important is because it's going to help with that house cleaning. It's going to let everyone know exactly which things they need to be looking out for, because what was used last year is definitely still going to be used this year.
Exactly. And one thing that I noticed in this too is that a lot of the vulnerabilities are only a year and a half old, rather than some of them that would go back in time a little whiles. But ultimately, the bad actors are getting faster. They're finding the vulnerabilities, figuring out a way to do exploits manually, and then automate them, then sell them. Hey, buddy, I got a exploitation kit for you. Here you go. Right. And so you're starting to see those ramp up from a speed perspective. So businesses need to keep up to date too. Right. Because I've been in this business for over 15 years. And I can tell you vulnerabilities when I first started, people are like, I patch about once a year. Like that's unfathomable at this point in time now. You better be patching a lot faster. But what are you patching? That's where your bone scans come in. So you know what targets to go after.
Yeah. They it's interesting that the agencies that published this list, they warned most of these exploits were older software flaws, and it's just that speaks to the fact that like just 1 or 2 years back, and a couple of them maybe 2018, I think, but like just 1 or 2 years back is considered like older software flaws, because the pace of things is so fast now that 6 months ago that's an old vulnerability. Right? Like we're on to the next one now. What was it with the what was the recent one that it seemed like they would announce, oh, hey, this vulnerability was discovered, but don't worry, we patched it, and the next week it was like 3 more were discovered. We're all along the same lines at that exact same thing. And it's just constantly coming. But one of the interesting things that I noticed about this list of the top 12 is that 6 of them are directly remote code execution. One of them is arbitrary code execution. So you got 7 of those top 12 are just focused on code execution. And the other 5 are all focused on either credential theft and exposure or privilege escalation. You know, a breakdown kind of what I would expect to see there, right, is you're looking at how do we get into this environment, and then how do we execute our code? Those are going to be your top 2 areas for any kind of any kind of vulnerability. It's interesting to me that we don't see anything really like data leakage or anything like that as the vulnerabilities that are being exploited.
Yeah, it's all about getting a hold of those credentials, right, and then getting privilege escalations so you can be the admin and do what you need. I think the other thing is important to call out, it's the vendors that they're going after, because the bad actors are going to go after popular targets, right? So Microsoft was on this list several times over. No surprise there, especially with as many things are going to the cloud. They have a fantastic service. They got a lot of coverage, but that also makes them a bigger target, right?
A lot of Exchange server vulnerability specifically. Covered on this list, and the list goes on. Also, it includes 30 more routinely exploited vulnerabilities from 2022. So if you're watching this and you've got some time in your busy schedule, but go check out the article on security affairs, and also just the advisory that was published by CISA, the NSA, and the FBI to take a look at those vulnerabilities, see if there's anything in your environment that might be affected. And like Trace, like you just said, Microsoft, congratulations, you're affected. It doesn't matter, you're affected. You are a victim of this. But talking about those vulnerabilities, one of the things that we talked about a little bit just there was credential exposure, and that kind of leads us into our next story. And Trace, this is one specifically you and I have talked about before, this exact issue. Last time you were on the show, you and I talked about improperly decommissioned network equipment that was being sold secondhand and still had full credentials and full network configurations for organizations on them.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that when I get in and I talk to customers and we talk about what's your data life cycle look like, right? And part of that decommissioning strategy of devices, even if just a hardware like a hard drive, for example, you still need to go through the process of scrubbing that data clean. And in this story that we're getting ready to jump into, what happens is they just pull the equipment out, they put it out for sale, they don't really destroy it, they're going to get a couple extra bucks, right? But they left the credentials on, so your Wi-Fi creds are still there. You can pull off your encryption keys from these devices, so you're literally selling access to your own environment for pretty cheap. And they don't have that mindset. It's, I just need to get rid of this stuff, it's old, let me get it out. But the risk and the exposure is pretty hard to pass up when you're a threat actor.
Yeah, exactly. And it's, what we're talking about specifically in this case is when we talked about this in the past, it was decommissioned networking equipment, which could apply to any organization. Specifically, what we're looking at here is decommissioned medical devices, and more specifically, infusion pumps that are being sold on the secondary market. And those all were network connected because there was a central point in the hospital sending out commands to say like, oh, hey, go ahead and kick off operations now, right? So these infusion pumps had Wi-Fi credentials on them. And this comes at a time when attacks against healthcare institutions and hospitals are on the rise, right? Historically, we've seen a lot of ransomware organizations, like the larger ones, who promise like, hey, we'll never attack like critical infrastructure or hospitals or anything like that. But with the rise of ransomware as a service and kind of splinter groups coming off and people being a lot more opportunistic, I think we're starting to see a increase in attacks against healthcare institutions. In fact, as we were preparing for the show today, a new article was published about a cyber attack, a cyber attack that has disrupted hospitals and healthcare across 5 different states, because all of these organizations in 5 states were owned by one medical conglomerate. And so we've got decommissioned medical equipment being sold on the secondhand market, and it still has access to these security credentials because that's your network information is part of your security. And so now attackers are able to just pick these things up, know how to navigate your network already, like right off the bat. It's not hard to pull into a parking lot and jump on a Wi-Fi network as your initial access point for intrusion.
Well, I mean, or even just sitting someplace on premise in the building itself, because there's so many people walking around. You could easily sit in the food area, the gift shop, the lobby. People won't come up and check you out, but you're going to get that incredible strong signal while you're in the building.
Why? And because this is not just your general public access Wi-Fi that is there for the families and for the patients, right? This is the internal network of the hospital, used for critical functions like operating medical devices. That's what's being exposed here.
And what you'll also find is that a lot of organizations haven't gotten to a secure service edge, true infrastructure. You can use a couple other buzzwords like zero trust, right? Mm-hmm. So if I have those credentials, that's enough to get me on, because there isn't something validating, hey, that device was decommissioned, don't allow it to talk back in. That MAC address is gone. That credentials are no longer invalid, right? There's some of those safety mechanisms aren't there in a lot of infrastructure elements. Yeah.
So this is interesting. I mean, it's just it's a reminder. It's a good warning if you're working within cybersecurity. If you're working at any organization, any equipment that you are responsible for, make sure that you're grabbing that back, that you're decommissioning it properly before you do anything like resell it or put it out in the market or even just throw it away. And that applies to everything, but especially when you're looking at extremely sensitive devices like medical equipment. And the further worry for me as I look at a story like this is these are medical infusion pumps. It's unlikely that they're going to have tons of like patient information on them, right? But if a company or if an organization is not properly decommissioning something as simple as a medical infusion pump, right? What devices are getting out there that do have sensitive information on them that extends beyond just something like Wi-Fi network credential access?
Yeah. And two, from a cost perspective, I really like to stress this point. The threat actors are buying lottery tickets, right? Yeah. $250 lottery ticket. I can get into your environment. I got that back door in, and now I can do something for tens of thousands or millions of dollars, right?
Yeah.
And exactly. That's kind of the key aspect of making sure that these devices will go. You'll get a couple of bucks, but make sure the information is wiped clean.
Yeah. Fully wiped clean. One of the interesting things too in this story, and it came from a couple different places, Security Fairs again, Security Week. I found it in a few spots, but some of the devices that were resold and some of the devices that were analyzed to find this out actually don't have any documentation on how to properly purge credential information from them and how to properly purge wireless network information from them. So if that option even actually exists within the system, which it should, for sure, right, finding out how to do that is also difficult. So I want to make it clear that by no means are we necessarily blaming the hospitals for this. It may have actually been impossible for them, or not
time consuming.
Yeah,
very time consuming. I came out of the telecommunications space. I was in the cable world for many, many years, and a lot of these devices are not necessarily coded properly for ease of function or ease of administration, right? Because they're just meant to be cheap, get them out the door, get them out there. And some of these devices, we'll get to that part later.
Yeah. So that's it's an interesting thing to keep track of. I always enjoy finding these kind of stories. I love one of the things that I love in our field is anytime that I see a story that is about like using physical devices or something to do this right. It's not just the software stuff. I really love anytime that I can find a really good threat and attack simulation red teaming write-up that involves something like, I got access by this really weird obscure method. I tell the story all the time, but I knew a guy who there was they needed to get access to a building, and so they knew that there was motion sensors on the other side of the door. So they stuck a piece of cardboard under the door with like a fold in it, and they got it up there, and then they just wiggled it around, and the motion sensor went off, and they were able to open the door. So the next time that they went back, the motion sensors have been replaced with ones that could recognize a human figure, and it would only unlock for that. So they bought a blow up doll. And slid it underneath the door and then inflated it from the other side. It popped up, looked like a human, and the door opened right up for him. Love it. So great.
And kids, don't try this at home. Just saying.
Kids, don't try this at home. Yeah, or you just get something as simple as, I think Victor's told this story before. Victor Weidrich, our head of threat and attack simulation, he's told the story before about just walking in with a box of donuts. Everyone loves the guy with a box of donuts. They'll let you right through any door you want. As long as you
especially
got
the hot ones, right? Just freshly made.
Good Krispy Kreme donuts. But our next story, let's move on to the next one here. This one I thought was really incredible and interesting. I loved the story as soon as I saw it. The research group Halcyon has published a report about ransomware command and control providers within the U.S. and specifically. They are calling out a company called CloudZ, CLOUDZY, and they are alleging that they are a command and control provider to APT groups in a host of countries, including places like Iran, North Korea, and Russia. Mm-hmm. So with this one in particular, what they're alleging is that CloudZ they started operations, I believe, in 2008. Here in the U.S. They have a New York address and phone number associated with the company, so they are an ostensibly American company. They're an internet hosting provider, but according to Halcyon's research, they are alleging that as much as 60% of the activity at CloudZ is actually malicious in nature, accepting cryptocurrency payments in exchange for anonymous use of remote desktop protocol and virtual private server services at the company. So essentially just operating as a command and control infrastructure hub for ransomware groups that are trying to operate within the U.S.
Yeah, and the other thing in this article is their main operations is in Iran, but they created the image of the American company, right? So they're pretending to be, of course, something they're not, to sell the illegitimate services.
Yeah. So some of the things that are alleged in this article, right? The researchers pointed out that, hey, there's usually, if you're an internet hosting company, you're usually doing a lot of know your customer work, really finding out exactly who it is that you're working for. And we've seen this recently in the last couple of years, right? There has been a increase in attention paid to, websites and services that are being used for malicious purposes. Or being operated by people who have, shady backgrounds, and people just saying like, oh yeah, I contacted the ISP and I contacted the data hosting center for them, and they've been taken offline now because these places want to know, hey, is our infrastructure being used for things that we wouldn't want it to be used for? And so they reached out apparently to CloudZ and were basically stonewalled and brushed off. And they thought it was treated like it wasn't that big of a deal. So they just started digging in, and they found a lot of suspicious things. So separate business registrations in multiple different states, Wyoming, New York, and Nevada. But I think really interestingly here is that they found a lot of employee overlap between CloudZ and another company based out of Iran, ABR-NOC. And both of them started operations at the same time in 2008, and there's a lot of employee overlap between the two. And so what they're alleging here is that this is not actually an American company. This is an Iranian company, and that they are basically explicitly set up to allow for hosting of command and control and operating as a command and control hub for these different ransomware groups.
Yep. And the other thing I thought it was a nice tie-in to our other conversation pieces is that the ransomware attacks launched by these organizations were aimed at hospitals and healthcare organizations.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. And so what they are, what the report talks about, though, is the fact that this is essentially just a liability loophole, right? This group is essentially relying on the fact that, like, you wouldn't blame the taxi driver. This is the exact metaphor that's given in the dark reading article, right? You wouldn't blame the taxi driver who drove a robber to the bank, right? He didn't know. He just drove the guy to the bank. Whatever the guy did once he got out of the car, right? And so they're essentially trying to exploit this kind of liability loophole by saying, like, oh, we didn't, this wasn't our intention, obviously. We weren't built for this. They're just using us in a way that is not not what we intended for our service to be used for. So it's interesting. It's again, this is all alleged, but it seems like there are some pretty strong ties here, and some pretty strong indicators that point out that while that defense might be used, there may be something to uncover there, and I don't want to say too much about that. More than I need to, but it is a very interesting read to go through Halcyon's report. And again, we found the story on darkreading.com. But that leads us to, I think, what I'm most excited about, our most interesting story of.
Oh, yeah.
So this was fun. Actually, I got to help with this one yesterday. A little bit, and by help I mean I reviewed it, looked for typos, and then got it up on our website as a blog. But it's been picked up pretty quickly by a lot of organizations, a lot of news organizations across the web. And that is that GuidePoint security researchers, in this case specifically senior threat intelligence, I want to say analyst, I don't think that's the right title, but senior threat intelligence, Nick Finn, wrote up a blog about some activity that they are seeing when it comes to the Cloudflare tool, Cloudflare tunnel, also known as Cloudflared, with a D at the end. So did you have a chance to look this one over, Trace?
I did. I really did, because the thought process I have here, it's as we as security practitioners get customers to have a more mature environment, what happens is the threat actors have less easy vulnerabilities to go after. So what they need to do is figure out how to take over, repurpose known good products and tools and applications for their purpose, right? And this is a perfect scenario of that, where they're able to say, I'm going to reuse the Cloudflare app, which is a legit app, very good at what it does, and I'm going to sneak some things under the radar.
Yeah. So what's happening here is attackers, they already need to have access to the environment in order to be able to pull this off, right? They have to have some way of getting Cloudflared, which is the executable name, onto the machine, or find that maybe it's there already if they can gain access to that. But essentially what they're doing is they're creating an outbound HTTPS connection, and whoever controls that tunnel that is being created can use services and private networks through the Cloudflare console to then execute further follow-on on that victim machine. So they're abusing the fact that most places are going to have something like Cloudflared whitelisted, or they would see it pop up and not necessarily, take a second look, because they're going to see the name Cloudflare and know, like, that's Cloudflare, of course. Why wouldn't we be using Cloudflare in this environment? So if the attacker is extra crafty, and maybe they've been doing some reconnaissance for a little bit, they can figure out exactly which areas in an organization it would be most likely to see Cloudflare traffic popping up. So they can utilize this. But one of the interesting, one of the things about this that is kind of so nefarious, is that using the Cloudflare console on their end, so the attacker using their own Cloudflare console to manipulate this, they're able to manipulate the tunnel that they've created, so that essentially it's only communicating with them when they want it to be communicating with them. So they can turn on and off this channel of communication, which makes it incredibly hard to identify when this is happening, because if you're not looking at the console in real time, if you're not watching,
you'll miss it
in real time.
Totally miss it.
Yeah, you'll completely miss it, because Cloudflare isn't writing to logs, right? So it's just happening in real time. You'd have to be catching that traffic and saying, oh, something suspicious is going on here. But then even if you do catch it, they're going to turn it back off, which means that you're not going to be able to do forensic analysis and kind of try and figure out what kind of command and control they're using, what kind of infrastructure they're using. So they're able to really granularly control when that communication happens, so they can drop in, do a couple things, get out of Dodge. It's really incredible.
Yeah, like I was saying earlier, this really feels like, to me, like I'm watching the Mission Impossible movie, and they're figuring out a way to break in right through the normal channels. And so what's going to be real tough is, to your point, catching this real time. So there has to be some additional rules set up and eyeballs on it. And then get these guys out because they're super stealthy.
Yep. So the way that Nick wrote this up as far as why this matters, again, this is GuidePoint senior researcher Nick Finn. The availability of persistent mechanisms that can be effectively lobotomized when attackers aren't actively utilizing it is extremely powerful. And then on top of that, it now has the ability to exfiltrate data using nothing other than an SMB share. Right. So as soon as they get in there, they can grab whatever the data they want, export it by SMB, lobotomize that connection, and just be done. And then still have that persistence sitting there in the background. So there's a lot of really fascinating research that went into this, and you can read the entire write-up on our blog at guidepointsecurity.com. It's called Tunnel Vision: Cloudflare Abused in the Wild. But he's got write-ups on everything, some really great visual documentation of what he was doing and what he saw, and everything that they were able to recreate. And it really just points to the fact that as we look at security tools that we're bringing in, and we look at everything that's happening inside of our environments, it goes right back to what you were saying at the beginning of the show, Trace, right? Mm-hmm. Having a full inventory and understanding of what is being used in your environment and how it could be used. If you are operating at an organization and you use Cloudflare for XYZ, but you don't use Cloudflared, that should be something that immediately flags for you, right? You should be able to say, I have this manifested. I know exactly what we're using in our environment, and that's not one of the tools. So we're going to look into that.
Yep. And you can also find that that recommendation goes back to a lot of different frameworks like CIS 18. Number one and number two, know their hardware, know their software, right? Yep. What apps do you have? And that's a struggle for a lot of organizations today. And that's why we try to reach out and give them guidance on do the following so you know what's supposed to be there. So when the anomalies show up, it's a whole lot easier to identify.
Yep. And they also point out a couple ways that you can try to defend against malicious Cloudflare use if Cloudflare is something that's in your environment. Things like DNS logging, firewall logging, command line execution and logs. And then EDR file monitoring, right? Specifically looking for files that match hashes for various versions of this software, and blocking any kind of downloads of that software, right? If it's not something you're already using in your environment, why is a machine trying to download Cloudflare, right? What possible purpose could an end user have for downloading Cloudflare on their own machine, unless they're trying to set up a weird work from home kind of gig, right? So there's some recommendations there. So I highly recommend you go check out the blog on our site, guidepointsecurity.com/blog. It will be the top one, the top listed blog on there for a bit, probably until we get to about midway through this month, which is when we'll publish the next GuidePoint Research and Intelligence Team ransomware report. So that'll be a fun time.
I'm looking forward to that report. I can't wait.
Yeah, that's going to be a good report. I think especially there's been some great stuff happen in the last month, and there's been some other great ransomware research out there that I can't wait to see capitalized on as we continue to do our own. So with that brings us to the top of the hour. That covers all of our stories. So thank you so much for joining us, Bharat, David. Thank you so much for joining our conversation as well. We saw your comments. We appreciate it. If you have any thoughts on the kinds of stories you would like to see us cover, if you have anything like that, go ahead and leave those in comments on these posts. We can see those types of things. We can take a look at them and see if it's something that we have thoughts on that we'd like to cover ourselves. But until next week, Jonathan, I believe, will be out again for DEF CON. Lucky him. But until next week, when I find another co-host, maybe it's you, Trace, maybe it's someone else.
We'll see how it goes.
We'll see how it goes. I have been and will continue to be Tristan Morris.
And Trace Hollifield.
And we will catch you next time.